Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCS Summer Playoffs Round 1 overview and analysis video. We're finally here. It is playoff time in the LCS, and I think you could really make an argument that of all of the regions that we cover on this channel, especially the major ones, North America and the LCS has the most important playoffs of any region, because remember, it's the only region with no championship points, no qualification system. The top 4 teams from the summer playoffs are going to be moving on to, at the very least, play for an opportunity to go to the World Championships, and that is a very, very big deal here. So even already early on here in round number 1, all of these games really do matter, and we've got some good ones here today. We're going to be covering the first 2 series of the LCS playoffs, but if you're excited, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you think was going to happen in these 2 series? Did you see them going the way that they ended up going? You know, they were both relatively close series, and did you expect that? I'd love to know you guys' thoughts down in the comment section below. Of course, who overperformed and underperformed your expectations. Would love to get an idea of kind of where you guys' heads at are on these teams moving into the next round. But of course, it's time to jump right into the action. If you're new here, what we do on this channel is we're going to go game by game in each series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll give a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of each series, I'll be giving a player of the series. Of course, we'll be going over a little bit of everything. At the end of the episode, we're going to be previewing all of the upcoming action for the next week, and so that's going to be winners round 2, that's going to be losers round 1, all of which are very intriguing matchups all set up by today's games. But without further ado, let's jump right into our first playoff series of the split here in North America, and it's gonna be a good one. This is a matchup that I think is really intriguing between 2 teams that, as I talked about in my preview video, really have kind of exact opposite arcs, if you will, over the course of this split. Of course, I'm talking about the number 3 seeded Evil Geniuses taking on the number 6 seeded TSM. Really fun matchup on paper here. EG was a team that, you know, was looking super good, obviously, at the beginning of the split. Everything was rolling. They were tied for first for a majority of this split in the LCS, but things started to collapse down the stretch, specifically in week number 5, where they went 0-3, and everything just felt a little bit worse. They come back in week 6 with a new jungler. Shaden has officially subbed in for Armeo and looks to be the starting jungler for the rest of the year for Evil Geniuses, and, you know, that really reignited this team. Everybody played well in week 6. They're moving into the playoffs as the number 3 seed, and there's a lot of reason to believe in them. They're a very complete roster with arguably the MVP of the league in the mid lane in Jojo Pune. So some high-end talent, a really good mix of veterans and young players that are getting their shot, and, you know, players who have been here before versus players who haven't exactly had a ton of experience in like Shaden and Ayla's case. It's just really, really intriguing. I really like the construction of this Evil Geniuses team, but they're staring TSM across the rift, and TSM is the team that I think is the most underrated going into the playoffs. I think a lot of people are going to look at their week number 6 and see a team that went 0-3, see a team that didn't necessarily play up to their expectations, and, you know, say that they're a team that's not going to do as well in the playoffs. I disagree. I talked about it a lot in my playoff primer. I could absolutely see this team being a top 4 team and going to Worlds if things end up working out for them. I think the talent on this team has absolutely been there. They do have the high-end talent to be able to make it interesting. Insanity has been an MVP, an all-pro caliber player over the course of this split. You add on to that the fact that Wild Turtle and Chime have been crazy consistent. Boogie's been a good jungler. Haunter's struggled a little on the top side, but TSM really does have a formula to be able to make it work, but they do have to have better form than whatever they had in week number 6, which was definitely a problem for them. They looked so good in week number 5, though, that you can definitely get the idea of where this team could win a lot of games. I think matchup-wise, it's very intriguing. I talked about it. Whoever wins the mid lane matchup is likely going to be walking out of this series with a win, and so a very, very fun matchup, but there are a lot of players in this series, and all of them are going to matter. So let's go ahead and go over these games and see how these players ended up doing. Of course, nobody's eliminated by losing this series. They're just going to be moving down into losers bracket, but winning this series puts you 1 series win away from going to the World Championships, or at the very least playing an international best of 5 in the 4th seed's case. And so let's go ahead and talk about it, starting with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was TSM. They were able to take the first game in this series in 25 minutes nonetheless. A really dominant performance coming in from TSM, and this is what I wanted to see from this roster. I wanted to see them show up, look a very dangerous Evil Geniuses team in the eyes and say, I'm not afraid of you. We're going to be able to take you down. We can force you to play off of your back foot, and we can take some of the positives that you've had over the course of this year and kind of neutralize them in a way that other teams have just not been able to do all that consistently. This was a great game from basically everybody on TSM. There was no weak link in this. Everybody was doing their part. A lot of people got time to kind of shine and get the spotlight, but the main one for me is going to be my player of the game, Insanity, in the mid lane, who, yes, I do believe is the best player on TSM at the current moment. I think he has certainly been the one that has expressed the most amount of, willingness to carry for this team, and his eclectic champion pool, I think, to say the least, in the mid lane has certainly actually been a positive, a boon for this team over the course of the split, whether that's the Graves mid or just a lot of the other marksmen he's willing to play. Obviously, in this game, the Lucian that we've seen kind of pulled out by some people over the course of the playoffs, Caps notably over in the LEC in that matchup against Excel, not working out really at all. That one wasn't clicking, but Insanity made it look relatively easy going into a very good player in Jojo Pune in this game. If Insanity's on, like if he's going to click and be the better mid laner, I actually find it very difficult to imagine a world in which TSM drops this series. I really do think he has that big of an impact on how this game ends up going, mostly because I think Jojo obviously is such a major factor in what Evil Geniuses wants to do, but Insanity is also such a great carry in the late game. He's a great team fighter, and he knows how to end games super easily, I would say, super consistently, and I think that he can do that, especially when you give him something like Lucian that can win early and kind of skyrocket the game out of control. You get that into a matchup like Ahri that wants to move around the map but doesn't necessarily have the same kind of trading power. In the early game, Jojo's going to have to give up a lot of pressure, and he just wasn't ready to do that. The team wasn't ready to respawn, or respond, I should say, around that, and so good for Insanity. The rest of this team still played well. Boogie was awesome on the jungle rel. I'm pretty critical of jungle rels, typically speaking, because I do think that's a pick that you either are winning on or losing on, right? Like, you're either super aggressive or you're not on the jungle rel, and in this case, Boogie was really good, definitely better than Shaden, who did not have a very good game. Jungle mid was firmly in favor of TSM, and I think that was a big reason they were able to take the game. Wild Turtle, want to give him a big shout out, is now officially the all-time kill leader in the LCS. Absolutely has deserved it, has played since the first ever split in LCS history back in Season 3 spring, and so, really just a fun player to watch. We all kind of thought that after his time on Immortals, with that split on CLG right before it, that it was probably going to be the end of his career, but get some time in Academy. Eventually gets the call up I should say Challengers, not Academy. Gets the call up to TSM midway through the spring split and has really made the most of it, with his time here in summer being a big positive. Him and Chime are very, very good as a bot lane. I think Wild Turtle's really solid. I think Chime is a very good support, but I've talked about that for years on this channel. Chime is someone who I would consider, if he was on a top team, I think he would be a genuine all-pro caliber guy. It's just not necessarily had the opportunity. And then Haunter was stable. He actually won top lane pretty hard in this matchup as the Ornn into the Cassante, which is just going to be a positive for TSM overall. Really, it's jungle mid that I think was most noticeable, but just a good game overall for TSM and a pretty dominating win over a good team. And then for EG, this again goes back to highlight some of the problems that I think people kind of identified with this team moving into the playoffs, which is the fact that they really rely on mid lane pressure and the ability to play through mid lane to be able to create a lot of their mid game prio. And they didn't have that in this game. It's not that the rest of the players on the team are bad. I want to make that clear. It's not JoJo wins and the rest of the team is, just getting dragged along. It's the fact that their game plan and their style of game really relies on numbers advantages in the mid game, and they can't generate those if their mid jungle loses. They just aren't able to do it nearly as consistently, and that was the problem in this game. Jojo Pune's gonna get my dud of the game in the mid lane on the Ahri, just completely out-pressured by Insanity on the Lucian, was never really able to catch up, and that was a major problem. Shaden was also really bad on the Poppy. I very much debated giving him dud of the game in game number 1. We saw some dissension towards the back half of week number 6 between these two. I didn't really want to read into it too much because that felt like, just a regular thing to have happen. We just had it happen in front of the camera, but Shaden is still very new to this, right? Like, he's someone who's only played 3 games at the LCS level in his entire life. To be immediately thrust into a playoff position where this team does want to qualify for Worlds and really does rely a lot on jungle pressure, it's a big ask from a player who has been inconsistent over the course of this year, and so, it's not really surprising to see him not have a great game here in game number 1, but they're really going to rely on these two, obviously, to continue to create pressure throughout the rest of the series. Revenge losing in the top lane matchup was also not very good. Like, you definitely needed to have some pressure there, but Unforgiven and Ayla were relatively fine. Turtle and Chime, I would say, are definitely more relevant over the course of this game, but that was mostly because EG just didn't have pressure to be able to play for the Kai'Sa. This really was a mid-jungle difference, and I do think if that goes a little bit differently throughout the rest of this series, then things are going to be fine for Evil Geniuses. I trust JoJo to be able to make something happen over the course of this series. It was just a rough game 1 from EG in general, and basically a perfectly executed game game plan from TSM. This is what I wanted to see from this team, and this is why you can't take them lightly, because they are going to be able to capitalize on your mistakes, and their advantages do line up rather well with the things that Evil Geniuses tends to struggle with. So TSM generating momentum early, but EG needs to fight back. They certainly don't want to go down 2-0 in this series. You know, fighting back from an 0-2 deficit against a team like TSM is going to be very difficult. Winning 3 in a row is not going to be easy. So a big game 2 for EG and a big game 2 for TSM. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Evil Geniuses. They were able to take that game number 2. They were able to tie the series up at 1 apiece, and was that ever really in doubt? We've covered a ton of series on this channel up until this point, and I think every single one has started 1-1. Every single series that I've covered from every region up until this point on the channel has been 1-1. That's got to be at least 10, 11 series. Kind of wild, like a weird coincidence, but EG continuing the pattern here in LCS with a game 2 win on red side, might I add. Both of the first 2 wins were on red side. Very curious, because blue side has really dominated every other region, but I'm just stalling time because this analysis section isn't going to take very long. This was Revenge's game. It was a revenge game, if you want to consider it maybe a little fun title, maybe something to call it. This was a revenge game. The dude went 18-2-8 on Jax in the top lane. That is 1 assist shy of 100% kill participation, and that 1 assist that he missed was only because he timed out after dying. And so, I mean, unreal performance coming in from Revenge. This is genuinely one of the best top lane games I've seen in like a very, very long time. Certainly one of the most dominant. He owned this game. Like, this was ridiculous to watch. It is so clear who the best player on the Rift in this one was, and it wasn't clear for that for like the first 10 minutes of the game, because honestly, Hanser was up like 40 CS in this game, but as soon as the action started happening, as soon as we started getting fights, it was Quadra, and then Penta, and it's like, okay, never mind. Revenge is utterly destroying TSM's hopes and dreams here, and he's single-handedly tying up this series. They took 11 towers. I think Revenge got a bunch of those as well. Just a ridiculous game coming in from him. He's player of the game, by the way. I don't think I really need to justify that decision. Revenge was so good in this one, and man, if he's gonna play like this, like even halfway like this, the rest of, like, this is the best top laner in the West kind of performance. I have not seen anything out of any top laner in the West in 2023 quite like this Jax game. I'm pretty sure this breaks the record for most kills on a Jax in global history. Someone might correct me if I'm wrong, but there's just no way. There's simply no way anybody else has gotten 18 kills on Jax in a major league in the history of League of Legends. I'm sure somebody will tell me in the comment section below if that's wrong, but I just don't believe it, right? Like, this is the most. This is the most for sure. And it happens in the playoffs. Like, it happened in the playoffs as well. So, really massive stuff for Revenge. This was a statement game, and one that I think a lot of people are going to remember about him for a while. Shaden obviously was much better here. He was able to control a lot of the tempo of the game, and he really did a lot of the early lifting for Evil Geniuses in terms of making sure the pressure was in their favor. But, you know, Shaden was mostly set up. Ayla was really good setup this game on the Rakan. Both of them, I think, played really well. Jojo and Unforgiven certainly did their part. Jojo in particular moving around the map much easier on the Ahri. Now that they didn't have something like the Lucian to have to contend with early on, like you're playing into the Lissandra, who, yes, is going to do a lot better, quote-unquote, better than Lucian in, I guess, team fight scenarios where you're playing from even. You know, the Lissandra's going to be able to lock down the Ahri, make it easier for TSM to deal with her. However, Jojo's still going to be able to move around the map, and it gives you so much more prio in the early game to be able to go out and make plays. That gives Shaden so much more freedom to play a lot more aggressive, and I think it just generally unlocked the map for Evil Geniuses. I think TSM really needed to keep their foot on the gas in terms of mid lane matchups, something that was going to be able to pressure early, not allow Jojo to move around the map, because the entire team, like I said before, plays through the idea of having Jojo just move around everywhere on the map, be a part of every single play, and I think that was a lot more accessible and easy for him to do in this. But I mean, I'm just giving a lot of superlatives for ways to say that, you know, other players on this team did well until it was Revenge's time to just straight up win the game and win every team fight on his own. A ridiculous game coming in from him. And then for TSM on the other side, you got revenged. Like, sorry, there's really not a lot I can say here. Hanser did a good job trying to shut him down in the early game, was doing a good job on the Rumble to exert that lane dominance that we know that pick really specializes in, but by the time we hit the end game, there is no team fighting him. Like, he's single-handedly going to win every single fight that they run into. Boogie's gonna get my dead of the game here on the Rel because, I mean, legit was getting one shot, couldn't even engage towards the back half of the game, and that makes that champion completely worthless. Like, there's no coming back from that, right? If you can't engage on Rel, then what are you even supposed to do? Insanity, like I said, lost pressure a little bit more in the early game than obviously he did on the Lucian, and that was a problem for the macro. Wild Turtle wasn't very clinical, but was getting blown up instantly by Jax in the late game team fights, and Chime was relatively fine, but again, like, what's Thresh supposed to do? You can't peel a Jax. Like, it's so much harder to peel Jax because he can just constantly move around and jump on you so long as he has wards and he bought Shojin. He consistently wasn't able to be auto-attacked. Like, how do you play against this champion when he's got 18 kills? I just don't know. I want to sit here and be like, TSM could have done this and this and this, but this is one of those games that you just have to look back on and go, well, it happened and we got to move on. Revenge was allowed to get super far ahead in this game, and that's okay, but it's not going to happen again. We can't let it happen again, and I assume that it will not be happening again. I would be surprised if either he got Jax or if they didn't put a lot of pressure into him in the top side just to make sure. And even if they don't, like, you're not going to get another game like this in the playoff series. This was just ridiculous, but really good on Revenge. And a game, like I said, that he's probably going to remember for a long time. But now the series is tied up at 1 apiece, and momentum has certainly shifted into Evil Genius's favor with that win. Is TSM going to be able to, regain it and show that you need this kind of miracle performance in order to beat them? Or is EG going to say, this was just the kick in the pants that we needed. We now know the identity of what we want to play through for the rest of the series, and we're going to play towards it? Well, let's find out now and see who takes the advantage in this game number 3. The winner of game number 3 was Evil Geniuses. They are able to take game number 3. They're able to go up in this series 2-1. And again, this is a big win for EG. They're back on the red side in this one, and they're able to take it again. Red side's actually been very, very positive in this series. 3-0 through the first 3 games. Not really what I would have expected, but it looks like the confidence that they were able to build in that game number 2 has translated into another one in game number 3 here, because this was a much more traditional EG game. This was getting a ton of pressure on JoJo on a roamer in the mid lane, allowing him to move around the map and just watching everything fall into place. This is what I was concerned about after draft for TSM. Nobody's really talking about it, and I do understand it because at a baseline level, this draft really isn't all that bad from TSM. I really like the idea of Kai'Sa mid into Ahri. I think it gives you a big option in the late game because you should be relatively safe enough, and you're going to be able to outdamage basically everybody on the side of EG to be able to carry. You're giving yourself a Jinx and an Ornn and a Rel and a Thresh and a ton of other things that are going to be able to push you forward. The problem is that specifically going into Evil Geniuses, you pick something like Kai'Sa mid, JoJo's just going to go everywhere on the map because Kai'Sa's not really going to be able to deal with that. And that's what EG was able to do. Like, the EG is basically perfectly built to punish a pick like Kai'Sa mid, and that's exactly what happened in this game. JoJo's a very clear choice for player of the game. He was point and click on these REEs, on these charms, man. Like, it is actually ridiculous when you see one of the most talented players in any given region in the world, really, in JoJo's case, be able to play a champion like RE. Like, it's just, he can't miss. He can't deal with it. Especially by the time we hit the end game, TSM really wasn't able to keep up a lot in terms of vision, and, they were walking into Fog of War and darkness all the time. And EG definitely took advantage of that, getting charms out of nowhere and just being able to capitalize on a couple of players having to walk in basically by themselves. But this was, if game 2 was a revenge statement game, this was a slightly less emphatic JoJo statement game. This was a really, really, really good one from JoJo, and they really did play around him. Big ups to Ayla. Thought he was really, really good in this game on the Rakan, was everywhere on the map, was definitely the better support, which we will get to, but another really good game coming in from Ayla. Shaden did a good job of facilitating, but, Shaden, Unforgiven, Revenge, I don't want to say they were bad, they were just kind of there, right? Like, they just kind of existed in this universe, and JoJo really was the one that kind of carried them across the finish line. There were a lot of moments where EG tried to throw this game, if I'm being entirely honest, tried to give gold back into the hands of the Jinx, and tried to make it a lot more difficult, but with JoJo there playing as well as he was on the RE, it was going to be a pretty difficult game for them to end up losing in the long run. So, in the end, really good game from EG, but a lot of credit to the mid laner and their potential MVP. And then for TSM on the other side of the map, this is just a game where you kind of got outplayed basically from moment one. Again, you can't draft this hyper-scaling lane into JoJo Pune. He's just going to take advantage of it too hard. We've basically seen JoJo lose a couple of times this year, and every single time it's the same formula. It's attack him early. It's make him, put him into a matchup where he can't pressure and just leave lane and either play for ganks or just play to try and get JoJo behind, because nobody else on EG is going to be able to be as comfortable taking the resources, not because they're bad players, but because that's not their playstyle as a team right now. But for for TSM, again, you opt yourself into this Kai'Sa-Ahri matchup where the Ahri can just shove lane and just go everywhere. And that's going to be able to find picks on Insanity. It's going to be a lot easier to find picks on Boogie. And unfortunately, this game, it was really easy to find picks on Chime in the support position, who's going to get my dud of the game. You know, I'm really high on Chime. I really like him as a player, but this might be his single worst game of 2023. Up until this point, this was just not a very good performance coming in from him. And I like him. Again, like, I think he does a lot of things right, but sometimes you're going to have bad games, and this was a bad game. I see a lot of conversation around him being like, he's only good on the Rakan. I don't quite think that's the case. I think there are players that in the LCS that I would definitely associate that with. Someone like Busio kind of comes to mind a little bit, although he's gotten better, I would say, on some of his other picks. But I think Chime is a lot more versatile than people give him credit for. I think the problem in this game was just the fact that he was the one that was face-checking a lot of the Fogavore and ended up walking into Jojo Pune multiple times and giving a ton of gold over to Evil Geniuses. I'm not going to try to defend him in this one. It was not a good game. This was definitely a game where you can point out and say, I got to do better next time, but I don't think it's really indicative of him as a player. I think this was more of an outlier. Wild Turtle was trying to bring back some gold towards the back half of this game, but there's only so much you can do. A lot of it was EG messing up more than it was TSM making a lot of the good plays, right? You have to be able to capitalize on mistakes, though, especially in a region like NA, to be able to make things work. But like I said, I really do not like the idea behind this draft. I really do think you put yourself in a position where you really needed to make sure that you didn't let Jojo get out of control. And when you put control of the game in Jojo's hands, oftentimes he's just going to be able to win it like he did in game number 3 here. But definitely something to learn, I would say, from both of these teams. TSM is definitely going to need to be a little bit more proactive if they want to keep this series alive, but EG now has the chance to close this out in 4 games. They've definitely looked like the better team across the last 2. Is that going to stay, or is TSM going to fight back? Well, we're going to find out now, because the winner of game number 4 was TSM. They are able to get the job done. They're able to tie up the series at 2 apiece, and we're moving to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, and I think that's what we all really wanted out of this series. I know a lot of people on the internet are very surprised to see this, and you know, all I have to say to that is, you guys should have watched my playoff primer. You guys should have watched my video. You guys should be watching my videos. I saw a post on a social media thing. I don't remember if it was Reddit or Twitter or where it was, but they were like, no one was predicting this to go to 5 games. Watch my shit, man. Please just watch my shit. I promise I make good content. I promise I do my research. I promise. And I figured TSM was going to be a much tougher out than people were giving them credit for. I said in that video that I wouldn't be surprised if TSM ended up making Worlds out of this region, that they very well could be a top 4 team if everything starts to go right. And while I did think Evil Geniuses was better, I certainly didn't think TSM was going to just blow over in the wind. I thought this would be a close series, and it's exactly what I have thought it would be. What am I talking about? Anyways, TSM ends up picking up the win. A lot of really good candidates for player of the game in this one. I think you could give it to Haunter in the top lane on the Rumble. Really nice performance coming out from him. He's actually had a surprisingly good series. I say that in a way of like, not because I think, you know, Haunter is bad, but rather I think Revenge is just really good, and I think that matchup was pretty EG favored, at least in my eyes, but Haunter has very much been able to hold his own, specifically in the 1v1 early on in the laning phase, with basically the exception of game number 2, and then the rest of the team really stepped up as well. But my player of the game is going to go to Chime in the support position. Just talked about what was maybe his worst game of the split or of the year up until this point on the Thresh in game number 3. This one was much better on the set in game number 4, pulling out some of that dark tech. We've seen Chime actually play it quite a bit on stream in Champions Queue, and so really fun to see him be able to bring it out on stage. We're going to be seeing more North American supports kind of leaning into that set support, and I like it. You know, as an idea, I think a lot of the AD carries in the current meta do play off of set relatively well, including the Varus that they did end up going for in this game number 4, but, you know, Chime executed on it really well. If you're going to go for an engaged style support, why not get someone that can really do something once they get in there? He's not just a CC bot, although he does have a ton of CC. He can really do a lot of damage if you're not ready for him, and especially if you're not building to try and stop it. And Chime was a massive problem for Evil Geniuses throughout this entire game. I think a lot of people are going to want to give this to Haunter. I think there are some people that are going to want to give it to Boogie as well in the jungle on this Sejuani. A really good game from him. This was a very, control the tempo, dominate the jungle matchup kind of performance, and really not allow anybody on EG to generate any sort of, positive experiences and positive tempo throughout the game. And I think Boogie did a great job of that. Insanity goes to a matchup that he can press early. And again, like, I don't mean to just reiterate this idea, but I don't really see anybody else on the internet specifically talking about this. You see a lot of people, obviously, including the broadcast, bringing up the idea that, oh, if JoJo doesn't play well, EG can't win. But it's really really not as simple as that in my eyes. I think you're kind of misdiagnosing the problem if that's all you're saying. To me, it's pretty clear that if JoJo has the ability to move around the map and create numbers advantages, then EG knows how to play that style. They have gotten super practiced at being able to play through that. But when they're forced to kind of move over to a different style to play through top lane or to play through bot lane, they're just not quite as practiced and not quite as experienced on it. I really don't think it's a talent thing. I see that kind of spread around everywhere where it's like, if JoJo can't carry, then nobody else in this team can carry. I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's because Unforgiven can't carry. I don't think it's because Revenge can't carry. I simply believe it's because they don't really have a great idea of how to play out the mid game if JoJo's not moving around the map, and especially helping Shaden in the jungle, who really has struggled in the mid game in this series. I think that's a much more accurate way to end up describing what ends up happening. It's not a talent gap. I think it really is just a practice gap for EG, and they're really struggling with that. JoJo opts into a very risky 1v1 here with the Yone in the mid lane into the Tristana and doesn't win it. He's not able to capitalize on that, and because of that, EG just doesn't really have the pressure that they need to execute on the plays that they've become very familiar with, and so they end up falling in the mid game really far behind, and they just can't return. Like, yes, I also have seen the comment of like EG and TSM to an extent are bad at playing from behind, and while I do believe that is true, I think that it is, again, more so they know what they want to do in the mid game, and they just can't execute on that when they're in particular situations, and I think that that has kind of been the case for EG throughout this entire series. JoJo is done of the game, by the way, for opting into that Yone matchup and not playing it particularly well. It's not like he played good this game, but, you know, I don't want to blame Unforgiven or Revenge or someone like that on the fact that they ended up losing this. I really do think that the team is just so laser focused on their one style of play that it ends up hurting them. And trust me, I'm not trying to be an apologist for the team. I think that somehow is even worse, but I think that's a more accurate way to diagnose what the problem is with Evil Geniuses. Shaden was not good in this game. He's been very poor when JoJo's not been able to help him out in those roams. And while I think the side lanes are fine, like Revenge lost, but it's, you know, Rumble into Jax, it's going to happen. And I think Unforgiven and Ayla were generally fine this game. It's just not going to be enough. TSM's going to be able to do too much in the mid game, especially if they're going to be able to play through, you know, Insanity and Haunter, and if Chime's going to be super active, it's just going to be a lot more difficult to win. And so, nice game from TSM, again, identifying the way to take the lead in this series and executing on it. This is exactly what I wanted to see from this roster, and, you know, I hate to say it, but they're proving me right. This is another one of my takes that I think has just aged really well, whether or not they're able to win this series or not, because remember, I did pick Evil Geniuses, but to have a lot of faith in TSM, I think is definitely coming back in a good way right now. But this series is very close, and we're heading into a Game 5. It's do or die. Obviously, loser is not eliminated from the playoffs, but winner is one series away from Worlds. And so, a lot on the line here. You definitely want to be the one staying in winner's bracket, keeping that extra life available if you need it. So who's going to be able to do it? Will it be EG? Will it be TSM? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Evil Geniuses. They were able to take this game number 5. They're going to be moving on to winners round number 2 with this 3-2 series win, and honestly, they've earned it. They deserve it after this win. It was a very good series, but they won this game dominantly. They were by far the better team when they actually got the ability to play some of the dark tech that I think they'd been keeping hidden over the course of this series up until this point, because they pulled out the Aatrox in the top lane. And I know a lot of people have really been talking about Aatrox as a very sneakily great pick in this meta, and while I do think Aatrox is very strong, I think we're still underestimating the impact that something like a Rumble can have in the top lane as maybe the best top laner. But Revenge pulling out the Aatrox on R5, going into something like the Ornn, it absolutely dominated here in this 5th and final game. Not only is he going to get my player of the game for the 5th and final game in this series, but he is a no-brainer choice, in my opinion, for player of the series as a whole. He was the best player in this series just in general, and you've got to give a lot of credit and happiness to Revenge. He finally gets to play for a good team in the playoffs. He finally has an opportunity to stretch his wings a little bit in games that matter, and he takes full advantage of that opportunity by taking down TSM and just looking fantastic. He sets the kill record, I believe, on Jax in game number 2. He pulls out the Aatrox and dominates in game number 5. Basically everything you could ask from a top laner and more in this series. Just great stuff from Revenge. Hopefully he's going to be able to keep this up, because this is best top laner in North America levels of performance, and they're definitely going to need that. Top lane has been a position that has been kind of exploitable by a lot of teams in the LCS. Maybe with the exception of Golden Guardians, there really aren't a lot of teams that just never lose through top. And even Golden Guardians, like, that's a recent development for Licorice. And so Revenge playing at this level and being someone that can consistently win, even without like a ridiculous amount of resources being dumped into him by the rest of the team, is a massive advantage for Evil Geniuses, and he played really well in this series. Of course, The rest of the team also played well. Want to give a big shout out to Ayla. He had a really good series, and he's not going to get talked about at all for how well he played, but Ayla was actually phenomenal. Definitely the better support in this series, and easily the most influential player, in my opinion, in the bot lane throughout the entire series. And so, really good stuff from him. I don't think he's going to get the credit he deserves, but JoJo looking really good on his signature. Silas, this is the champion I think we all kind of most associate with JoJo Pune at this point in his career. It just gives him a little bit of everything. It gives him the ability to play aggressive, both in the early game, the mid game, and the late game, right? Like, depending on the wave state and the matchup opportunity. And so for JoJo, really like what he was able to do on this champion, but it's not a particular surprise to see him play it well. Shaden was good in their wins. He was pretty miserable in their losses when JoJo wasn't able to get out on the map, but Shaden's not somebody who needs to be able to take over and win every game. That's not what they were playing through even in their wins in week 6 when he was joining the lineup. And then Unforgiven was almost a complete non-factor in this series, which is fine for the team overall. If you've got other win conditions, if your top laner is going to play as well as they did, then you don't really need your bot laner to win every single game. But Unforgiven was probably the most forgettable player on Evil Geniuses in this series for what that's worth. But they're winning, and they're moving on, and TSM unfortunately drops down into the losers bracket now. Again, they're not eliminated, which is good because I really still like this team, but they are going to be moving down to the losers bracket. I do believe that they're going to be facing Dignitas in the next round. I could be entirely wrong. I don't know how this bracket works. The LCS has like no rules explaining what, like how this works, whether or not they switch sides, whether they don't switch sides, whether it's based on seeding, you know, what, I have no idea. I'm just going to take a guess and say it's Dig because they've switched sides in the past, and I talked about that in my playoff primer, but for TSM in this game, they just got outplayed. Like, they were blasted in basically every single lane. Dud of the game is pretty easily going to go to Chime. Talked about his good game 4, but outside of that, he was not very good in this series as a whole. The Thresh game in game 3, the Braum game here in game 5, both pretty bad from him. He was consistently missing Braum ults. It just felt like he was mentally not locked in, and that's definitely unfortunate. I still like Chime, and he's had good playoff performances in the past. You know, last year, I think when this team kind of snuck in the summer split, people forget how good TSM was in the playoffs last year, and Chime was a big reason for that, but not a good series from him here. Wild Turtle wasn't particularly good outside of game number 1. Haunter was good this series, but pretty bad here in game 5. You know, Boogie got out jungled, Insanity wasn't really an impact player on the Tristan. It just wasn't a very good game 5, and that's unfortunate, because I really do think TSM more than held their own across this entire series. They just weren't able to get the job done at the end. You know, if you're going to highlight some of the issues, I think that they had trouble, you know, kind of continuing to keep their foot on the gas against a team like Evil Geniuses. That's kind of what you have to do. You need to be able to punish them in the early game basically every single time you run into them, or they're going to be able to take advantage of the things that they're good at. And I think TSM definitely towards the middle of this series had a couple problems with that. Games 2 and 3 definitely did not need to be the way that they were in the situations that they were. And by the time that they figured out what they needed to do, they just couldn't execute on it anymore, which is definitely unfortunate. But for TSM, I definitely think you're still in a position where you can be a scary team as the playoffs go on. I'm certainly not going to give up on this team as a whole. I think they'll likely be the best team in lower bracket depending on what happens in the other series, and I still like TSM quite a bit, and I think they can do quite a bit as the playoffs go on, but they're going to be moving down, and Evil Geniuses is going to be moving on. We'll preview both of those series at the end of the video, but for now, it's time to move on to our second of the Winners Round 1 series. And we're going to jump right into it now. As we just said, it's time for Series 2 of Winners Round number 1, and this one was just as intriguing on paper, and I think for a lot of people, more intriguing. I really like the first matchup, but this is a very, very, very good clash of styles. A team that has been white hot as of recent, especially against good teams, and a team that just has talent amongst talent. We have a matchup between the number 4 seeded Team Liquid and the number 5 seeded NRG, and man, I'm excited to get into this one. Team Liquid is a team that, while being incredibly inconsistent over the course of this entire year, has had completely gigantic highs. I mean, when they are clicking, when everything is working, when Summon and Pioshik in particular are playing well, this team is very difficult to deal with, and especially with the addition of APA into the mid lane to solidify an avenue for them to be able to play through that lane in particular, I think it's just been a massive positive for Team Liquid. They have a bunch of really talented players on this team, but NRG are in a very similar boat, and you want to talk about a team that's really figuring it out at the exact right time. That's what NRG is. They were really struggling to begin the split, their first ever split as an org, but they have certainly figured things out as they have gotten to this point. Their top side of CLG players in Dokla, Contracts, Palafox have really been the driving force for what NRG has been able to do over the course of this split. I think Contracts has been an all-pro caliber jungler. That's where I had him in my all-pro rankings, was third team. I think Palafox has been very, very close. I think you want to put him in the top 3, I totally understand. Dokla has been pretty solid, even if his lane stats don't necessarily back that up. He obviously has been great in team fights where he really shines anyways, and I honestly think FBI and Ignar have been underrated the last few weeks. FBI certainly makes some mistakes. He'll make at least one in every game where he's just like in a really good position, and then he just walks up and dies for no reason, but Ignar's actually been really good over the course of this entire split, and just generally speaking, FBI's laning phase has been fantastic. Teams have just not been able to beat these two all that commonly. In the 2v2, it's really just been like Berserker and Sven, and then like 6A and Huhi, and that's it. Everybody else has kind of just not been as good in the 2v2, including Yon and Core, and so gonna be an intriguing matchup here between these two teams. I picked Team Liquid in this one. I'm lower on energy in terms of what I think they're going to be able to do at a playoff level. I think they have some consistencies that are going to be exposed, or at least that's what I predicted, and I like Team Liquid. As inconsistent as they are, their top-end talent is really good, and I do think they found the secret to success, if you will, by adding APA into the mid lane. But are they going to be able to get it done against a really good Energy team, or is Energy just a lot better than I'm giving them credit for? We're going to find out right now, because we get to kick it off with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was NRG. They were able to take the first game in this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is a really nice win. I think confidence and momentum is going to be very big between these two teams. Both are very momentum-oriented. NRG really struggled when I think they weren't playing as aggressive as maybe they had in previous splits, and same thing for Team Liquid. When they're on, when they're working, they're really dangerous to have to go into, but when they're off and when they're not working, they're a pretty easy team to take advantage of, and unfortunately, it looks like we're getting a more negative version of Team Liquid, at least in game number 1 here. It really was not a great performance from the team, but let's talk about the good things that NRG did first. Player of the game was actually very difficult because honestly, everybody on the team really stepped up. I think Dokla was probably the only player where it was like, yeah, he was great in team fights, and I don't want to take anything away from what he was able to do. He was so much better than Summit in the laning phase. Just overall, a really good game from him, but Contracts was everywhere on the map on this jungle rel. FBI and Ignar dominated the bot lane matchup. I'll talk about Yon. I think he really was the lone good member of Team Liquid in this game, but player of the game for me is going to go to Palafox in the mid lane on this Azir. I really like his Azir. I think it honestly gets undervalued because of Palafox's reputation. He's more so known as kind of a melee assassin-oriented player. You know, kind of the token one in North America, if you will. Every region has to have their, I don't want to say Zeka clone, but kind of player in that mold, if you will, and I think Palafox definitely fills that requirement here in North America, but he can play the Azir at a really high level, just like Zeka as well, and he did really well into APA here. I'll talk about APA in a second. He has never really been a Jace player. In fact, I don't know if I can recall APA ever playing Jace, and I've watched him for years, and so to see him, you know, pull it out here in game 1 of the playoffs, it's certainly an interesting decision, but Palafox was clearly more proficient on his champion, and I think it definitely showed. He really was awesome in this game, and I know a lot of people are frustrated and feel like he was snubbed of an All-Pro appearance. I didn't have him in my All-Pro list because I think that he had a few more bad games than people give him credit for, but his highs, like his good games, are just as good as almost anybody else in the entire league, and I think he definitely showed that off again here. Like I said, though, FBI and Ignar also really good. FBI was doing so much damage on the Xayah, and some fantastic setups coming in from Ignar in the support position. Like I said earlier, those two have been incredibly underrated, I think, over the past, 2 weeks in particular. Ignar really has been one of the best supports in the LCS, and that is certainly not something that I expected to say, you know, even just going into this split, but Contracts was really good on the rel. When he gets ahead, he's, like, really, really dominant. Pioshik had a bad game, and then, like I said, Dokla was also pretty good, especially in lane. I think the laning stats ended up lying in terms of the talent level. He was really good. They just won across the board. I know it took him a while to close out the game, but they got there in the end, and that's all that really matters. And then for Liquid on the other side, not nearly as good of a game number 1 as you could have possibly wanted. You just were the worst team out of these two. It really didn't feel like you were ever all that competitive. I think there was, you know, at places where you were able to generate some leads. I thought Yon was actually pretty good in this game on the Kai'Sa. Obviously, that's a pretty easy champion to be good on. It's a really strong pick in the meta right now, but I thought Yon did a really good job of, you know, generating those leads and pushing those advantages throughout the game. I think APA was dealing damage and Summit was, you know, affecting team fights, but APA was also making a lot of major mistakes and honestly did not look very proficient on the Jace. It did not look like a champion that he had all that much practice on, and that tracks with, I think, all we know about APA, which is that he's not really a Jace player. But dud of the game for me is pretty easily going to go to Pioshik in the jungle. Not only was he completely out-jungled in the early game, he really wasn't all that effective in team fights, and he ended up, you know, making a really, really bad play that put them super far behind towards the back half of this game, dying around Scuttle Crab to get Baron over for free, which ended up costing Team Liquid, like, all the pressure in the entire game, and made a game that NRG was probably going to win pretty comfortably, even easier for them, and so just a lot of mistakes coming in from Team Liquid. This did not feel like a very good game plan in game number 1. They went towards a lot of the power picks in the meta, but it doesn't feel like any of them were all that accomplished on any of these picks, and so I would expect a pretty drastic overhaul in gameplay moving into game number 2, and in terms of ideology, I just don't really like the ideas that they went for here. Hopefully, they can figure some things out, because obviously I do like this team, but it was not working here. But for Energy, big confidence booster. You kind of decimated them in game number 1. If you're going to be able to do that in game number 2 as well, like, if Team Liquid loses confidence, I just don't have a lot of faith in this team to be able to rebound, and even though I do think that there were avenues for Liquid to keep this game alive, Energy was definitely better, and you got to give them a lot of credit for that. So, is Energy also going to be better in game number 2, or is TL going to fight back and continue the trend of 1-1 series starts? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Energy. They are able to take game number 2, and we did it, boys. We finally freaking did it. We have a 2-0 start in a series for the first time on this channel in summer of 2023. Can we all get a round of applause? I need to hear you all clapping in the comfort of your own home while watching this video. I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Anyways, Energy was really, really good in this game, and while I think the scoreline would indicate that this was a pretty back and forth game, and I do think there were moments where Team Liquid looked like they were going to be in it, a couple of good team fights coming in from them, Energy really was the one with a lot of control in this game, and they're going to be walking out of this 2-0, you know, with a nice lead, a very comfortable lead, and feeling pretty good about this series overall. They looked really solid in this game. A couple of their individual players are just playing at a really high level right now, and it's definitely worth pointing out. The first player I want to point out on the side of Energy is my player of the game, Contracts on this Poppy. Man, North American Poppies can be super hit or miss. Like, we really haven't seen a lot of people be able to utilize her to the same extent that we've seen some of the Eastern junglers and Eastern top laners be able to kind of dominate on her. Like, I really do think in the right hands, she's still one of the best picks in the entire game. She really can neutralize a lot of different types of comps and make it very difficult to end up winning the game, but, you know, you have to play her right. You have to be very aggressive, and you have to be willing to go in and play on the knife's edge. You got to be super comfortable with the champion, and a lot of people just aren't. Contracts definitely is. He's been really good on Poppy basically for the whole year up until this point. He was good on her last year as well. He's one of the few players in North America that I would say, please continue to pick this champion because he just plays it fantastically. R5 Poppy was very, very bad for Team Liquid to end up seeing here with their comp, and it completely shut off Summit towards the back half of the game. He couldn't flank to save his life because the Poppy was just going to completely deny him entry into any sort of engage, and then it makes Tristana a lot harder. It makes Leona a lot harder. It makes Kai'Sa a lot harder. It makes the game in general a lot harder and a lot more difficult to play. So credit to Contracts. He knew exactly what he needed to do in order to generate the lead in this game, and he went and did it. But the other player that you gotta shout out is FBI. He pulls out the Ezreal here, which, you know, I'm pretty low on Ezreal as a pick. I think it's pretty low damage. It's pretty safe, but pretty inoffensive, right? Just something that I don't think is going to dominate a game, but something that can be relatively safe. I compare it to something like the Ashe in the current patch. I think they're both in a pretty similar spot of you're not really picking it if you want your AD carry to, like, carry the game for you, even though Ezreal has a little bit more of that in him than Ashe does. His damage isn't the same as a lot of the big hyper carries at the current moment, but what it does offer is consistency, and you know kind of what you're going to be able to get out of it, and it really does help the rest of your team because you don't have to pump resources into the Ezreal. But FBI was so good in this game, and he was really good in game 1 too. He might be the most consistent member of this team over the first 2 games of this series, and it's good to see FBI performing well. A lot of people have very much criticized his 2023. He was far from the problem on Evil Genius's last split. I compared him and Someday quite a bit on that team because it really felt like both of them were getting a lot of blame for things that were going wrong just in general with the org, and I didn't necessarily think it was fair to just blame them for, you know, EG not exactly being as good as everybody wanted them to be. But FBI moving over here to Energy, a little bit of a slow start, couple of problems, but feels like he's integrated himself better with the team and is now playing at a pretty high level. Really good game from him. Ignar was solid on the Rel, Palafox was solid on the Syndra. Doklo was a little bit hit or miss on the Renekton. Summit definitely had some opportunities in this game. However, Summit also couldn't really do anything towards the back half of the game because of the aforementioned Poppy. So in general, Energy pretty clinical. I know the game looks pretty close, but I think they did everything they were supposed to. Contracts and FBI in particular were awesome in this game. And then for Liquid on the other side, man, it just feels like you're so disconnected. I'm not sure if this is a new phenomena, because really this is not something that they've looked as bad at over the course of this season, but Core in particular just looked to not be on the same page as anybody else on the rest of this team. Pretty easy choice for dud of the game. What was the Leona engage at the end of this game? Like, is he on comms? Did his microphone turn off? Like, what happened here? This was like a classic Hylissang level play in all the wrong ways, where it's like, what are you doing, man? He goes in to 5 people, immediately gets blown up, and the rest of his team's like, whoa, hey, what are you doing, man? Like, you can clearly see they were not ready for that engage, and I just don't necessarily understand, you know, what happened? Like, what happened there, man? Core's not typically the player that's going to make a mistake like that towards the back half of a playoff game, so certainly concerning. I know a lot of people are criticizing APA for his Tristana, and while it certainly wasn't perfect, I don't think it was that bad either. He certainly was dealing damage. I thought Pioshik was probably the player that was keeping this game the closest. Summit was good. I thought Jan was fine, but generally speaking, Team Liquid just didn't have the oomph behind them in this game to be able to keep up. It always felt like Energy was going to be able to take it this entire time because of how well that jungle bot was playing as a duo, and Team Liquid really didn't have anybody on the team that was keeping up in that way. While they were dealing damage and while they were getting picks, mostly on Dokla, but, you know, in a couple of different scenarios, it just never really felt like they were going to be able to translate that into any sort of sustained success. And honestly, Team Liquid's looked pretty anemic throughout the beginning part of this series. Hopefully they can pick it up because they're now down 0-2. They are on series point going into game number 3, and they're in danger of being the first team to be swept globally in the playoffs, at least for major regions, in summer, and that's certainly not a title you want to have on your resume. Energy obviously wants to move on to that next round as fast as possible, but for Team Liquid, you got to win 3 games in a row now against a good Energy team that you've given a lot of confidence to. Not exactly the best situation to have found yourself in. Is Energy going to be able to close it out in 3, or is Liquid going to at the very least keep this series alive for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Team Liquid. They are able to take game number 3. They're keeping this series alive at the very least for now, you know, putting themselves in a position to at least go to game number 4, and man, did they really have to work for it in this one. In particular, Summit had to work real hard for that because he carried this team across the finish line. It wasn't just him. I do want to make sure that, you know, there is a narrative that this is like a 1v9, and I don't think that's quite fair to Jan in the bot lane, who again played really well, but I can understand where the narrative comes from because there were multiple players on Team Liquid that just did not play well in this game and have not been playing well in this series that I think have really cost TL quite a bit. A couple of the players that I think they really needed to see step up, and a couple of the players that have been very crucial towards their regular season success up until this point this year. So we can go ahead and talk about it, but for Energy, you're not gonna sweat this too much, right? You're sitting in a position where you're up 2-0. You'd have to lose 3 games in a row. Losing game number 3 certainly isn't the worst situation in the world, especially considering you honestly didn't play all that bad in this game. You just got a little bit unlucky that they had the best player in the game and that their lane opponent couldn't quite keep up, in my opinion. But let's talk about Team Liquid first and foremost. Player of the game, pretty obviously, is going to go to Summit in this one. I know that there's this big prevailing thought that Summit doesn't get the job done in playoffs, and while I do understand where that comes from, he hasn't necessarily been the biggest playoff performer throughout his entire career, basically in any region. I do think that the idea of someone just inherently being not good in playoffs after being a good player is just kind of something that is bound to not be true eventually, right? Good players are going to be good eventually. Like, I truly do believe that, you know, especially in League. There really isn't a huge difference in, you know, playing the game in the playoffs and in the regular season. It's just nerves, and, you know, eventually a good player is bound to figure out how to deal with that if they really are a good player, and someone's a good player. And so seeing him do well in this game, and honestly in this series up until this point, he hasn't been like the most dominant, but he had a chance to make an impact in game 2. The draft just really went against what his internal impact was, but, you know, here in game 3, he single-handedly won them the game, and that's really, really good. He's been great in lane, as he always is, but Summit's a good player, and for him to dominate game number 3 like this, I think is a very good sign, and a very positive sign overall. But Jan was also really good in this game. I know a lot of people are going to point out how APA was pretty bad, and I agree. APA did not look very good on the Tristana in this game. He's now been given the 2 best picks in the mid lane in the meta, and he hasn't really looked all that comfortable on either. The big concern is that the Ziggs has been banned out 3 games in a row now, and it's definitely looked like it's taken its toll on TL. APA, you know, hasn't necessarily lived up to his regular season performances. Maybe it's a nerves thing. Maybe it's just a playstyle thing going into someone like Palafox. I don't know. But APA certainly has not been living up to those expectations. But Jan, I think, has actually been really good in this series in the bot lane. This was a good Kai'Sa game, and he's been super consistent for Team Liquid over the course of this year. I didn't really give him a shout for All-Pro because I just think AD carry is so ridiculously stacked. And, Jan is definitely in the conversation, but I just think that there were a lot of players that I personally would have ranked above him, but he's been crazy good for Liquid. He's been very consistent, and I've hyped him up a lot over the course of this year. I've been positive about his impact, and he was good again in this game, but it's Pyosik, APA, and Core that continue to kind of struggle here. Core didn't have a very good game again on the Nautilus. Again, a couple of those engages just not necessarily working out, and Pyosik and APA do not seem to be on the same page. Obviously, they don't speak the same language, but it hasn't really affected them at all in the summer split, so kind of wild to see it really start to come into fruition here in playoffs. But good for Summit, good for Jan to be able to kind of set themselves and set their team into a position where it doesn't really matter all that much. And then for Energy on the other side, you would have liked to probably end this series in a clean sweep, but going to a game number 4 isn't the worst thing in the world. Still up 2-1, still have control of the series, and honestly, most of your players still played well. Palafox had another really good game on the Jace. FBI still looks very comfortable on the Ezreal, and I think Ignar continues to be solid on the Rel. It was just topside that ended up being a problem. Dokla is going to be done of the game. Kind of got run over by Summit in this game. If the Renekton had been a little bit better, this would have been fine. He was a problem in game 2, quite frankly, as well, and Summit would have had a big impact on that game if it hadn't been for contracts specifically on the Poppy, and so some concerns with Dokla not necessarily playing all that well, but it is Summit, someone who is considered maybe the most talented top laner in the league, and, I'm really not going to, overanalyze it and criticize Dokla for not having 2 good games into Summit. I think he'll be fine in the long run, but it is worth noting that it hasn't necessarily been smooth sailing, I would say, for him throughout this series up until this point. But like I said, if Palafox and FBI and Ignar are still going to play well, you're probably going to be able to win a game like this, in this series, even if every game goes like this the rest of the series. You can't expect Summit to be able to carry games like this every single time. So it is a nice win for Liquid, but you got to give me more than this. You can't just win based off the fact that your top laner is super fed. You got to be able to give me a complete performance before I really start believing that you've got a shot to be able to consistently take down Energy 3 games in a row. It's a very tall task, and it's certainly not going to be easy. Energy's still in control of this series, and even though we are moving into a game number 4, even though we are moving into a position where, Energy is technically on the back foot after losing game 3, I still think they have full control and full momentum in this series, and the onus is absolutely still on Team Liquid to be able to take that game 4 and look better than what they did here in game number 3. I like Jan, I like Summit, but the rest of this team simply has to step up and be good enough. APA in particular has been such a big part of what this team has wanted to do, and he's really struggled in this series. If he has a better game 4, they could be in a decent spot, but for Energy, just keep going according to plan. The formula is working, you just got to stick to it. So are they going to be able to close it out in 4 instead of 3, or is Team Liquid going to say, nope, it's comeback time and we're going to another Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was NRG. They are able to get the job done. They're able to take this series in 4 with that 2-0 lead, and they were definitively the better team out of these two. And I'm willing to put my analysis aside and say I was clearly wrong. NRG came into this series the better team, and they are walking out the better team. The heat that they have been able to generate over the past few weeks, getting hot, that is real. That is not fiction. That has not been fabricated. This is a legitimately great team here in the LCS, and man, I mean, we really got to watch out because they've been able to beat everybody up until this point. They took down Cloud9. They didn't take down Golden Guardians as far as I'm aware, but all the other top teams, I mean, that's a tough place to be, and they're going to have another tough test coming up, but man, this is a really good League of Legends team, and I'm really, really excited to talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Palafox, and he's also going to be getting my player of the series for this series as a whole. APA, unfortunately, just didn't really show up today. He got a bunch of champions that aren't necessarily the things that he's known for. The Jace, the Tristana, these things that you wouldn't necessarily consider his style of play, and unfortunately, Palafox was really able to take advantage of that by playing some of the things that, APA isn't necessarily as willing to pick up, and he looked so much better in this series. I know that a lot of people were frustrated with Palafox not making an all-pro team, seeing him as a snub, and a performance like this only goes to further, I think, that perception of him. What a great series overall for Palafox, and he's had a great year up until this point. He has definitively proven himself to be a top 3, top 4 mid laner in the LCS. He has been for a year and a half. For 3 straight splits now, I think you could argue he's been, at worst, a top 4 mid laner in the LCS. And so, at this point, it's undeniable. Palafox really is amongst the most consistent mid laners in North America, but the rest of this team was really good as well. Contracts was awesome all day today, and he's just been so good all split long. Contracts is one of those players that I don't want to say I was ready to give up on after his time on Golden Guardians, but you go back to his time on Golden Guardians and he's leading the league in deaths every single year, even with talent around him, and it's just like, it's not going to work. You know, his time after Cloud9 clearly is not going to be as fruitful like it was for so many players, you know what I mean? Like, leaving Cloud9 hurt a lot of players' careers, and it looked like it would be the same for contracts, but he eventually gets another shot on Evil Geniuses, gets some time on 100 Thieves as well, and really finds a permanent home on CLG and now on NRG, and has really become a great jungler for the team, being able to pilot a lot of the things that a lot of other LCS junglers just aren't capable of doing at a high level. The Ivor in this game was really good. FBI and Ignar were fantastic. FBI in particular was fantastic. 3 games of Ezreal this series, making that champion look ridiculously strong. Going into Kaisa every game, the champion that most people consider to be the most broken AD in the game right now, and he was just more useful. Ignar's been great. Dokla definitely struggled this series going into Summit, but when the rest of your team is winning as much as Energy was able to win in this series, it's not going to matter all that much. Just a great series from this team overall, and they've got to be so happy to be moving on. But for Team Liquid, again, very similar to what we talked about for TSM earlier, their split is not done. They've now got a very intriguing matchup down in lower bracket, but this must be a frustrating series for them because they quite frankly just did not show up today. You can say a lot of things about a couple of these players. Summit and Yon are really the exception, but Pioshik, APA, Core JJ, they just weren't awake today, and it's very frustrating. Dud of the game could go to any of those 3. I'm going to give it to Core JJ in the support position. This was a poor series from him. Now, I do want to say, I see a lot of people, and I mean a lot of people on social media. I think there was a Reddit post that had like 500 upvotes or somewhere around there that was like, Core only gets all pro votes because of his name recognition and he hasn't been good in a while. Now, this is just functionally not true. This is, of course, hyperbole and reactionary. There really is no other way to put it. Core JJ was phenomenal throughout the regular season, and he has consistently been a positive for even Team Liquid teams that have struggled in the past. I think a lot of his really good performances oft get forgotten because he's not the best player in the league like he was. This is not the Core JJ of 2018, 2019, but he's still a really good support, right? And to see a bunch of people say that he's not even a top 5 support because he had a bad day for Team Liquid, obviously it's narrow-minded and it's reactionary thinking, and there's no other real way to put it. Core had a bad day. I'm going to completely agree with that, but does that invalidate a lot of the good things that he's done to get Team Liquid to this point in the first place? Absolutely not. I would argue he was the best player on Team Liquid in the regular season. I know a lot of other people would like to say that's Summit, but Summit's inconsistencies were just a little bit more than what Core JJ was offering, and Core was phenomenal. So yes, he had a bad day, but do I think he's going to be fine? Yes, I think he's going to be fine. Yon was really good, and I think that if both of them have a good series moving forward, especially against some of the worst teams, you know, building their confidence back up, I think they're going to be just fine. But Pioshik and APA are concerning me. Pioshik is somebody who has struggled in playoff runs in the past for good teams, and you never really want to see that happen again here. And APA definitely struggled in his first taste, I should say, of the bright lights in the playoffs. Now, he was really put in a bad situation of having to play a lot of champions that aren't necessarily up in his wheelhouse. You know, I'm not necessarily saying that getting Ziggs banned out every single game is a problem for him, but you can't be putting him on Jace if he doesn't play well on Jace. Like, I don't care how strong the Jace pick is. If he doesn't pilot it at a high level, play the thing that he pilots at a high level. It really is that simple for me. And there are plenty of champions that APA plays. I just don't know if Jace is the one to pull out in a do or die game number 4 here. And then, you know, if those two don't pick it up, I think that it could be a problem for Liquid, because there really are a lot of good jungle mids in the LCS at the moment that are clicking that could take advantage of it. But Liquid going to be moving down into lower bracket now. Their next opponent is going to be 100 Thieves. Happy to preview that. And Energy is going to be moving on to face Golden Guardians. Certainly an intriguing matchup that's going to be very fun to preview. But both of these teams kind of moving in the opposite directions of what I expected. Liquid certainly not looking nearly as good as I think a lot of people wanted them to be. The inconsistencies coming out. And Energy looking just about as good as you could ask. Both of these teams looking kind of in extreme versions of themselves. And hopefully we can see Team Liquid turned around and Energy continue the momentum in the next round. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCS round number 1 overview and analysis video of the summer playoffs kicking off here up on the screen. You're going to see the updated bracket. Of course, losers is solidified. We'll talk about winners in a future video because the next video is just going to cover losers round number 1, those 2 series. And so let's go ahead and preview them right now. Of course, we're going to start off with TSM taking on Dignitas, a very intriguing series. I previewed this in my playoff primer video because this was a projected predicted matchup, and I had TSM going over in that one. I'm going to continue to say the same thing here. I still think they're just too talented for Dignitas to be able to overcome. What Dig really struggles with is anybody who pushes the tempo basically at all. Dig is the slowest team in any major region at the current moment, and TSM is certainly not afraid to try and play early. That's actually one of the things that I would consider them very, very good at, and so I would expect them to be able to generate some leads, but Rich into Haunter could be an avenue in which Dig tries to play for to generate their own lead if they can get some counterpick matchups, some red side matchups, ironically enough. Into TSM, I actually think that could be a major positive, but TSM should just be too good to go down in a series like that, in my opinion. And then Team Liquid, going against 100 Thieves, you know, Team Liquid looked vulnerable, Pioshik and APA in particular, in week number 1 or in round number 1, but if there's any positions that 100 Thieves have had trouble being able to take advantage of, I should say, over the course of this split, it's been jungle and mid. They just haven't necessarily been able to generate consistent leads there. Their big advantages have been able to come through bot lane. Doublelift and Busio have been major successes, but Yon and Core, I think, are relatively stable, and I think Core is going to have a better series. I think, in general, I would predict that Team Liquid just has too much firepower, and that 100 Thieves struggles will continue here, but you know, if Doublelift has a really good series, they can beat anybody. Like, they really are good enough to be able to make that happen. They just pretty much have always needed it to be through bot lane. Now, if Closer or Quid or Someday can really step up and be that, you know, carry that they haven't necessarily had in the regular season, that could be a complete game changer for this series. But unless they show that, it's hard to predict it to just kind of happen. You know what I mean? And so for me, Team Liquid should definitely be favorites going into the series. But would love to know what you guys' thoughts are down in the comments section below. Did you like my analysis? Did you agree with what I said? If not, let me know your guys' thoughts down there. I'm sure we don't agree on everything. Would love to know our differences. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about all 4 of the major regions, not just the LCS on this channel, and basically all of them are in the playoffs right now, with the exception of the LCK, who's going to be rolling around there soon. So if you want some comprehensive overviews of everything happening in LoL esports, especially with a lot of these teams kind of being, you know, potential Worlds teams moving into that, you know, last part of the year, this is the place for that comprehensive overview. Hit the subscribe button, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live, and I would really appreciate it. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.